Today, I'm talking about podcasting, Disney history, and a lot more with Matt Parrish of WEDWay Radio and the 3028. You're listening to the Tomorrow Society Podcast. Thanks so much for joining me here on episode 42 of the Tomorrow Society Podcast. I am your host, Dan Heaton. One of the reasons I started this show is because I wanted to take a smart look at theme parks and the industry itself while still being a fan and enjoying what I was doing. And I mention that because I'm thinking back to what inspired me to do this show in the first place. Obviously, I'm a big fan of Disney and the parks, but also it was some of those early podcasts that did it so well at the start. You had shows like WDW Today or the Season Pass podcast or Inside the Magic. It was amazing to hear these Disney fans going on about what they were interested in, some of the history of what Walt did years ago. And after that first group, which really inspired a lot of us, you had kind of this next tier. And I don't mean tier in quality, I mean when they arrived. You had podcasts like WEDWay Radio that showed up around 2010 and took it to another level. That doesn't mean they were better or worse. They just tried different things. You had podcasts that were looking at a more specific niche, or were just so well produced, using music and finding interesting ways to tackle history in a way we hadn't heard before. And WEDWay Radio is still going strong with Nate and Matt Parrish, and they've decided it's going to be their final season. And this seemed like the perfect time to talk to Matt about this, because you can do a podcast amazingly well, enjoy it, develop a good fan base, but when is the time when maybe it's time to stop and do something else? Can we all have our creative projects that we're doing? And there's so much more to explore. So I wanted to get Matt's opinion on WEDWay Radio ending and, of course, his other podcast, the 3028. It's just cool to connect with other fans of the parks that especially look backwards to the history, to where it was and how it evolved, yet are still interested in what's going on today. So it was really cool to get the chance to talk to Matt. Before I get to that conversation, I did want to give out a thanks for the ratings and reviews on Apple Podcasts that I received recently. It really helps to keep the show moving forward and progressing and show that you guys are out there and enjoying what I'm doing. So let's get to it. Let's talk to Matt Parrish. My guest today is the co-host of the long-running WEDWay Radio podcast with his brother Nate. He also hosts the 3020Eight podcast with Kevin Quigley. He's coming to you from the other side of Missouri in Springfield. It is Matt Parrish. Matt, thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Hey man, pleasure to be here. Just down I-44 from you. It's like we're next door.
Well, you are the third person from Missouri, the area, that has been on the show. Nate was on, and then also Mike Rallman. So You're joining a distinguished group here.
Other guys. Yes, guys I know. Guys I know well. I like that I'm the last of the three. This is perfect.
It was not by design, I promise you. It was not, okay, we're down the list. I guess we'll do Matt now. No.
We're running out of people. We need to. No, I appreciate it, and thank you for having me. And WEDWay Radio, long-running show, so long, they're going to have to, shut it off on us.
I don't believe that at all. And I definitely want to talk about that. But before we get into any of that, I'm curious, you've been doing podcasting for so long. Like, where did it start? How did you get into Disney and the parks, like, years ago in the first place?
So we as a family, and you having Nate on the show probably dug into this a little bit, but we as a family went to Walt Disney World a lot in the late 80s and early 90s. And so all of those experiences sort of became, I don't know, research, 20 years later, which is kind of weird. By the time Nate asked me to do a podcast, we had all of these years of, Nate reading lots of texts, and I had to sort of catch up on that. But we had all of these years of research, and we decided if we were going to do a podcast, we wanted to do it like an anthology. We wanted to do a podcast that it wasn't necessarily predicated on the now. So you could listen to it anytime, and it might be about 1942, the Disney company then, or it might be about, the opening days of Epcot or whatever. So we wanted something that would sort of live forever.
Yeah, no, and that makes sense because you find if there's so many shows out there about news, and I know you guys sometimes do news shows here and there, but there's a point where it's like you're speculating all these rumors and then they go away and then they're wrong, and that's kind of it. I know that you have kind of a radio background, and the show WEDWay Radio is one of the better sounding shows out there. How much do you think that impacts like how you do a podcast and how you kind of set it up?
I think it definitely impacted the editing process. I think for me, and Nate and I are a little bit different in terms of how we want the show to sound. Like, you may not pick up on it, but if you listen to a Matt show versus a Nate show, there are always, little subtle differences about, how we put together audio and all that stuff. And so I think for me, just because I had so much early access to audio equipment, now I didn't go to broadcasting school. So my background was actually in like media analysis, like the academic side of media, but I worked in broadcasting. And so I sort of fiddled with it here and there. As I became a broadcaster, I also became a podcaster. So I wasn't really experienced, but I did have the tools there, and that allowed me to sort of grow in my skill set. And Nate learned a lot of that on his own with his with GarageBand and, just fiddling with the sound for a while. It was like early days of radio. That's what it's kind of like early podcasting.
Yeah. And so what's the difference? Like you say you have a Matt show or a Nate show. What's like the Matt show? Like how do you define that?
That's really tough. The music interludes, what kinds of like topics are chosen, how much space there is between, when I stop talking and he starts talking, anything subtle like that is a dead giveaway for him and me, but like most listeners would never know.
Right, because I couldn't tell the difference in myself. No. I guess I don't listen close enough or something to the shows. So you mentioned Disney like history, and I know that's a focus even on your current show, but what interests you like about Disney history? How did you get in? Because I know a lot of people go to the parks, but not everyone who goes to the parks a lot is kind of studying theaters from 1920 and stuff and going into that detail. So what excites you about that?
Well, because to understand the parks contextually, you have to understand all of the influences. So when you walk down, Main Street, USA, and you make the connections to the Midwest, or you make connections to Walt's life, I mean, you can see that sort of explored in the park. So I think a lot of people look at Disney like it's a movie set, but it has all these disparate influences that sort of come together. They're all pieces of America or pieces of sort of Walt's brain or Walt's interaction with story that sort of come to life in the park. Now that's changed a lot, Dan. I mean, by the time we get to Magic Carpets of Aladdin, I don't know that we're I don't know how much we're cruising through Walt's brain anymore. But when you go to Disneyland, I really feel like you're living Walt's life. You're living in his brain in some ways. And I think that's what's sort of precious about it. Like we on the show on WEDWay Radio, even on the 3020Eight, we sort of walk through these different moments in time in Disney history when we go to the theme parks. But if you don't know anything about, Disney history, you're not going to really recognize it in the parks.
Right. And it's, having that background, I mean, you've been enough times as a kid and now as an adult. Like when you go to the parks, I mean, are you still, like you're taking kids and whatnot, are you still finding the time and kind of the ability to enjoy that side of it? Or is it, I mean, it's just kind of second nature by this point?
So it's second nature. And I think people get annoyed with me whenever we go to the theme park. So, but it's really special, like sharing and all of that with my son. And, what I've really found in doing the show is that I'm just learning, all of the time. There's nothing that I know sort of more than anyone else. I'm just learning about these different connections as I go. So if I go explore ye old magic shop or ye old Christmas shop at, Liberty Square, there's connections there to what, Esther Forbes was doing in her texts and how that sort of makes its way into the theme park and all, it's really cool to sort of look at that. And when you start diving deeper into what does this name mean on this shop, or what is this story behind, Gertie's over at Disney MGM Studio, once you start digging into that stuff, it's really fun, I think.
Yeah, for sure. And I feel like among my normal people that I interact with, I'm like, I know more about Disney than anyone. But then I listen to a show from you guys or Jim Hill or whomever, and I'm just like, I know nothing. I know absolutely nothing about the parks at all. So
I'm the same way though. I mean, that's the fun of it, I think, is that there's a lot of people who are sort of perceived experts, but it's just a bunch of people who love it, that explore it a lot. And you may look at them and say that. I look at a guy like Michael Crawford, who's written text and worked at Disney and worked in the archives. And I'm like, that guy knows way more than I do. You know what I mean? I shouldn't even be doing a show.
Yeah, no, he's a great example because, he goes into these nuances, or there's the Passport to Dreams Old and New that Fox Seafer does, where it's these nuances about pirates or Haunted Mansion. And I'm like, oh my gosh.
I know.
That's
right?
not in the book I read.
Exactly. And so that's the cool thing about Disney, is there's so many different source texts that you have to sort of combine. So here's a cool thing to sort of learn about Nate and I, is we never pull information from one text. We will combine efforts of pop culture sites that are out there, deep Disney history books that we've read, magazines that we've seen, and then other people we know. When we did the Western River Expedition in the finale season of WEDWay Radio, we asked Michael Crawford, hey, what was the song that was supposed to be playing on this attraction? And he's like, I don't know, but it was probably pretty good. So you have to ask around people who know, or, dive through different source texts or whatever to find info. But that's what I find, is there's no almanac for it. There's no encyclopedia for it. You just have to put facts together.
Yes. For example, something like that Western River Expedition podcast, how long does the research take, or how much research? Because, when you hear the episode, it sounds like you guys are just talking. You're like, oh, let's talk about this thing. And it sounds pretty easy, but I know there's tons of research, but what you just said may have made me realize there's even more than I thought. So how long does it take to do that?
It takes time. I mean, I think that's probably one of the reasons why the show will end at some point, is because it does take time. And you want to try to be as thorough as you can be, but you can never tell the full story on a 1-hour show. I mean, I could never pull from all of the people who worked on these things, because a lot of those people are still alive. If you could access them, you could get more information. But, we probably limit research on a show to about 2 weeks. And, sometimes that's a little long depending on the subject matter. But, to do a really good show, you're going to have to dive in and do some digging. What you hear is 90% of it is not scripted, but outlined.
Right, because if you script it, it'll get to a point where then you're just reading, and it's not as natural. And I've heard some of those, not you, but with other podcasts. So yeah, that makes sense to me. So you mentioned that it's the final season. I know you guys recently, I don't know if it was a month or two ago, had this announcement where you said, okay, we're ending the show. However, it's not ending today. We're going to do this final season with kind of a lot of the big things we haven't done yet. What made you and Nate decide, okay, now's the time to end it? Or, now meaning when the season's over? Man,
lots of factors. I mean, you have to think, when we started this show, Nate had a 3-year-old and I had no kids. I was barely married. 10 years later, his kid is 11, 12, and I've got 2 kids and a wife and different, jobs. And, I think we want to do other projects, and we felt like we didn't want to just let this die. And so let's do a final season that's sort of worthy of what we feel like we've accomplished with the show.
Right. Yeah. No, that makes sense. I mean, as someone, I've been doing this for a few years and have kids, and you can be amazed how challenging it is to slot 40 minutes or something of time out of a life at that point. And you guys doing all that research, I'm sure that plays a role in it. So going back to when you started the show, the Disney podcast landscape was very different. So, I mean, there weren't that, but, you had your Lou Mangello, you had your Inside the Magic, there's,
right.
Your Diz Unplugged, but there wasn't very much. So what was the landscape like for you guys? I mean, how did you fit within that at the time? What made you think this is something we can do and we can do differently, I guess is the way I look at it.
I think in a lot of ways, our show became a continuation of the Progress City Radio Hour. Now, I don't know if Nate will ever like admit that, but I think we looked at shows and we saw what was out there, and we knew, Lou Mangello in his early days when he had Jeff Pepper on the show sounded a lot like what we did. They would explore things, and then his show became different. It became somewhat more commercial and not as, investigative. And so I think we always liked the sort of learning aspect of the show and, telling a good story without it being connected to many commercial enterprises. So that was something we knew we never wanted to do. We didn't really want the show to be about meats. We didn't want it to be about, news. We didn't want it to be about trip reports or whatever. There were some shows that were doing it differently than Lou's. So WDW Today was a huge show when we started, and they had lots of listeners and guys that we, and I still do, respect a lot. And at some point they walked away from that show, as you might know. The landscape was weird because nobody was really doing history. Aside from a couple of Lou Mangello episodes, nobody was doing history like we wanted to do it. So the only show that was doing something similar to ours had like 2 episodes, and that was the Progress City Radio Hour, which was Michael Crawford and Jeff Crawford, who are brothers. So they were doing the show, and we were like, boy, I really like that. I mean, I think, they're not doing this style of show anymore. Let's sort of do a show sort of like that. And I think it just stuck.
And you mentioned WW Today, and that was for me one of the biggest ways I got back into Disney, that one and a few others, because one, they did so many shows, but you had these like guys, Len Test has been on my show multiple times, even now, right. And the enthusiasm is still there, but these guys were so into it, and it's crazy how many shows they did over the years. But
yes.
Looking at it, because, like you said, they've stopped doing it. I know that, Len and Mike Scopa still does a podcast, but it's different now. They kind of got disillusioned a bit with Disney, it seemed, and several of them did. But, what's interesting is, the podcast landscape has evolved so much. You have so many shows. Yet I feel like what you and Nate are doing is still not that done by most podcasts. So, I mean, how is your show? You feel like your show's evolved over the years, even with, it seems like you're still doing something different, but how has it evolved?
I think we're more knowledgeable. I think that the shows sound better, which is good. That's always a challenge when you're first starting. I think in a lot of ways it is somewhat disconnected, and so that makes it more connected to other things. Like, because we don't care about sort of building a show brand anymore, it allows us just to focus on the topics that we like or the themes that we like. We never wanted to make a show, hey, I bet a lot of people would like this show. That literally never entered our dialogue. And so now that we're more disconnected from the sort of Disney community, we can just talk to each other and say, hey, do you want to do a show about this? What's your ultimate show that you want to do? Or what's something that we did that you want to continue or whatever? And so I think that's how it's evolved. Another way that it's evolved is that it's become harder to do. We don't have the time. And so when you hear a show from us, it's not that we don't appreciate the engagement that we get or whatever. It's just that, life sort of gets in the way of, the creative process sometimes. And so I wish I could tell you that there was, that I sort of know how it's evolved, but I think organically it just did.
No, and that makes sense because basically that's how it works. You get better at certain things, you get interested in different things, but in a way, though, you mentioned about the branding, which I find really interesting, just doing a podcast, but some of the best shows can be done when you're just doing something that interests you rather than trying to do something you think people will be interested in, if that makes sense. So I want to get to your other show, the 3028, but I want to ask one more thing about WEDWay Radio. So you guys did several sessions at Kansas City Comic-Con. You did presentations with, one of them you released as a live podcast, which was really cool to hear, but it kind of about Disneyland 1.0 and Walt Disney. So how did that come together?
So we put that together just like we would a podcast, and we drew up an outline and, put together the visual parts that we wanted to do. Nate and I are both teachers, so we were sort of mindful of what a live performance or a live taping would look like, a live recording. And so we decided we wanted to do that. Now, actually, I can't remember if they reached out to Nate or maybe Nate saw a show there once and asked one of the producers of one of the cons, and then we ended up on the list there. So I love the Comic-Con thing. I think we'll actually do more of that and less podcasting.
That's interesting. Yeah. So when you do that, like when you present, obviously the big difference is you have an audience. But beyond that, I mean, what's kind of the big difference in how you present to that audience?
I think you have to focus on engagement. I mean, that's the biggest part of teaching, is that you got to find the guy falling asleep like there was in the first show we did, and you've got to get him engaged. Whereas when you're podcasting, that never enters your brain. You're in like you and I right now, you're like in a dark room with a microphone. I mean, which that's like 99% of broadcasting. So to sort of turn that into a performance is something, completely different.
Yeah, no, that would be a challenge, especially when you're used to doing that. But it's exciting to see. So I want to ask you about the 3028, which I know you do that show yourself with Kevin Quigley. And how did you get connected with Kevin, and how did that come together?
Kevin was a very early WEDWayRadio.com blogger, and Kevin actually got into Disney way later than Nate and I did. And what I love about Kevin is he has such a contemporary take on Disney, whereas I might be more obsessed with things that happened in the 40s, and he's more obsessed with things that are like happening now. And so it gives me a different perspective that I don't really get with Nate. Nate is so knowledgeable about things. He has a very deep and rich and sort of layered knowledge about Disney. And Kevin, he's more experiential in his fandom of Disney. And so he looks at Disney like a modern park goer would look at it. Like, this is fun because it's fun. It doesn't have to be connected to all of these things or all of these people. And it kind of has helped me refocus my love for Disney. So I met Kevin through his early blogging, and believe it or not, it was just sort of happenstance. I asked him to come on the WEDWay Now show. Nate was pretty busy at the time, and so I just kept asking him to come back, and he just kept coming back, and we decided that we had a really good chemistry and that we liked talking about Disney together. And so Kevin and I have never met in person. We actually just have formed a sort of viral bond.
Well, that's really cool. And, it's funny, I have like a question written down, which basically is like, so Kevin is the new enthusiast and you're more than, it's like you just described the same thing. But I don't know how many times on your show you hear Kevin say like, wow, this was so cool and this was so cool. And it's not always the things that you expect. Like his enthusiasm, I think, really helps to drive the show. Because I think you fall more in kind of the people like me who went to Epcot Center and went to MGM Studios and kind of fall into that. So, and I know you guys do a lot of lists on the show. Like, I particularly enjoyed the best bathrooms, and you had the best lobbies and transportation. So when you guys are putting together a list, like for a podcast, because you don't do like, some podcasters, there'll be like 5 podcasters and they all list their top 3 or their top 5, which can be, oh my gosh.
That's a lot.
It's a lot. It's like 2 hours plus. But, you guys just do like one list. So how do you kind of put those together when you're ranking something?
Very haphazardly. Like, hey, I'm gonna put together the show outline. You just fill in the gaps of what you think should go there. And so by the time we get to the show and we need to record the show, we got our top 10, and sometimes we shuffle the order within like 30 seconds of recording. So that's sort of how haphazard it is.
Well, that's okay, though. That's not always a terrible thing. Because one thing I think, to me, it's like a show where really you're like 2 fans, you're talking about the parks. I never really like am sitting at home going like, I can't believe that's number 5 and not number 4 or something. So that kind of goes to it. So what do you guys want to do in the future with that show? I mean, because there's a point where maybe you run out of lists. I don't know. I mean, is there kind of, have you talked about where you want to go forward with it?
I don't think you ever run out of lists. I mean, that's just the thing. I mean, you could list snacks, you could list old things, new. I mean, there's so many influences that you can list, and that's the same thing with WEDWay Radio. Like, you're never going to run out of history topics. I remember saying that same thing to Nate in the early days, like, dude, we're going to run out of things to talk about. He's like, no, we're not. And I was like, oh. And then over time I saw, oh, yeah, you could just take this a million directions. And I think you can with lists, too. Now, lists tend to burn, so what might be your top 10 today might not be your top 10 tomorrow. So that's a fun sort of aspect of it, is that lists are very now, and they change and evolve. And, I don't think we ever set out to be the list show, but then it just sort of became our identity, sort of.
Yeah, and I know you guys do other shows, so I don't want to pinpoint you just as a list show or something, or listology, as you will. But,
yeah, we like
Yeah.
We like the ology suffix there.
Yeah, I can't remember all of them, but there's like bathroomology or waterology or whatever.
Flushology, splashology, all of those.
I don't know why I'm focusing so much on the bathroom one, though.
Yeah, those are memorable. Yeah.
It stuck with me. Well, great. Well, I enjoy the show, and it's always fun to hear what you guys are going to talk about, and they're always well done. So I want to ask you just a few kind of not random questions, but different questions about your interests in the parks and such for a few minutes. So I know you went to Epcot Center a lot. So what are kind of your top few 2 or 3 favorite attractions that maybe aren't there anymore that you loved as a kid?
I think with, Epcot's such a weird animal, right? Because to appreciate old Epcot is to sort of appreciate a dying sort of entertainment. I don't think people sort of seek out edutainment in the same way they did when it was new. I mean, and that's true for a lot of museums. They have to reinvent themselves over and over and over. That's why museums have specific exhibits where they sort of draw people in. And Epcot's never really been able to do that in the way that I think the founders, not the intenders, but the founders really predicted that it would. I mean, if you think about its original concept of sort of showcasing industry, it did that in its early days. So it's had a hard time sort of keeping up with that. So in the early days, I think you have to pull what are the very large sort of thematic attractions that spoke to people then and sort of speak to people now. And I think Living with the Land, or the modern version, which is, or the old version, Listen to the Land, is one that sort of speaks to the overall concept or theme of Epcot, which is not just showing you the world of tomorrow, but allowing you to sort of cruise through it. And so that attraction has always been one of my favorites. And Nate and I used to argue about that one too. He didn't love it back in the day, but I think now he appreciates the sort of history of it. And I love it because it's still there and it still has its sort of original bones, which is great. The Horizons attraction, of course, is going to be at the top of any Epcot Center patrons list because Horizon combined all of the themes of Future World into one attraction.
Yeah. No, both of those are great choices. The funny thing about Living with the Land is that when I was a kid and we rode Listen to the Land, I remember that you would have these, you had the person on there who narrated, yes. And some of them were so bored. And you would just sit there and you'd be like, oh my gosh. And now, we're writing it now, and you would have thought, though, that removing that person would make it worse. But I think it actually made it better. I feel like now I ride it, and maybe just being an adult who's like, oh, this is kind of like how Epcot used to be. I love it so much more now. It's one of my favorite things there every time. So
I never miss that attraction, and I think you're right. I think maybe the host distracted from what you were supposed to absorb on that attraction, and now it feels more relaxed. It's something that you can sort of passively interact with, whether that's the different show scenes. And the pace of it is just so brilliant. I think that's what's missing. I mean, if you go on the Navi River Cruise today, it has that pace. And so, that idea of pace in that era was way different. And modern attractions don't really do that anymore. They have to sort of jump out at you at different moments and sort of re-engage you over and over. But I think the really good attractions don't do that. They just sort of allow you to experience them at your own pace.
For sure. And you actually see the lengths of the attractions. You look at it now and you have, even the Journey to Imagination now, or Navi River Journey, or Mermaid, they're all short. I mean, they're
yes.
all 5 minutes. And it's when you have a 15-minute or 20-minute or whatever, you can kind of let it kind of meander forward, where they're just not doing that anymore, which is too bad.
I think, when Disneyland was created and attractions were created, I don't think volume was something that they really considered. I think storytelling and, allowing people to sort of enter the worlds of, tomorrow and fantasy and whatever, that was the most important thing, was the theme. And then by the time you get to the 60s and the 70s and the sort of World's Fair aspect of creating an attraction, by the time you get to Walt Disney World, they needed attractions that people could go on and would hold large amounts of people because people didn't want to stand in line. But now with Fast Pass and the sort of reimagined way that you wait in line, which is setting an appointment today. You don't need attractions like Universe of Energy that last 40 minutes because you don't really wait in line that much anymore.
Right, because when I went to Epcot Center as a kid, amazingly, you waited in line for World of Motion and Universe of Energy and the Living Seas and stuff, which is still hard to believe. But, you know, there was benefits in that the lines moved very fast, where with Fast Pass, it's all kind of out of whack. But I know we could get into this for another 2 hours.
Yes.
And I wanted to ask you one more thing, because you are in Springfield. So I must talk to you for a moment here about Silver Dollar City. Now, I know Time Traveler looks amazing, but I don't want to ask about that. That looks cool. We know that. Fire in the Hole. One of my favorite things I've ever ridden, because I love that so much. It's like this weird, it reminds me a bit of like old Disney or like Knott's Berry Farm or something, where you ride through this indoor coaster and you have these kind of goofy scenes with the saloon and everything. And so how great is that attraction? Am I crazy in thinking that is a wonderful thing everyone should ride?
It's kind of a bizarre attraction, okay? Because like the spirit of Silver Dollar City at one time was in the Bald Knobbers, right? And they're sort of like bushwhackers, like Missouri Bandits, essentially. And so the sort of evaluating or looking at Bald Knobbers and what they did, in the sort of contemporary world, I think a lot of us are sort of scratching our heads like, why did they make an attraction about this, you know, ragtag band of people with hoods over their heads? I don't know, but the history of it is interesting because I guess that region, which is a little different than Springfield, Branson is sort of its own animal. They celebrate things in a different way. Like the culture they celebrate is sort of this backwoods culture. And so the idea of like, that attraction is based on like putting out fires, I guess, which is weird, is like fire departments. And there's a lot of like fire department themes at Silver Dollar City that are sort of woven through the park. It's interesting. It's something that everyone who goes to Silver Dollar City should ride because it's an attraction from a different era, man.
Yeah, I think there's a similar ride in Dollywood actually, but it's still not exactly the same. And the other last one is the Flooded Mine, which is the guns don't really work, as I found in that ride very well, but it's kind of like if you rode Pirates and it was a little cheaper made, but you got to shoot the pirates is how I would think of it.
Yes.
But that's kind of another old school kind of early interactive attraction that I remember riding as a fairly young kid. And yet it's still there, and my girls were very kind of mystified by it, and my daughter said it was like Pirates. And I was like, yeah, sort of, but that's a fun little ride, right?
Yeah, the Flooded Mine became the Great American Shootout, right? It was like celebrating the sort of frontier, or like the Wild West. When you rode it when it was the Flooded Mine, it was literally a mine that was flooding, and you were sort of boating through it while inmates were like trying to escape.
Yeah.
So, like, going back to the fire in the hole thing, like, what were we doing in there with those inmates? I don't know. And now we're, like, shooting in the prison. I don't know what's going on in there. But it is, like, it's a timeless, weird, classic attraction. And I think in that day, you know, they didn't have a storybook to sort of pull from. So they were sort of pulling from a combination of, like, Branson or, like, Ozarks themes and, like, modern attractions. And so what you get is like the combination of that, and it's very bizarre and it's very kind of fun. I don't know how to you know what, you didn't ask me about the most important attraction I think at Silver Dollar City, and it's not Time Traveler or Outlaw Run, it's Marvel Cave.
Oh, of course. Yeah, you get to, it's like a whole giant cave attraction inside a theme park, which is the craziest thing ever.
The whole theme park is based on the cave. So the Hershins, their father, bought that property with the cave on it that they could, you know, basically use as a tour. And born from that was this sort of town square that they built around it. And so when you enter the park, you immediately walk next to the cave because that was the original attraction. And beyond that is the town square. It's got a church, it's got the ice cream parlor, all that stuff. And then since then, they've sort of added like, you know, 100 different attractions, but everything was sort of rooted in the sort of cave and town square that surrounded it, which is amazing. And if you go through Marvel Cave today, that's really the sort of, you know, the sort of charming part of that park is that whole sort of front end of it.
Yeah, the front is great. It's a really cool park. I mean, I'm in St. Louis with the possibly the worst Six Flags park in the country.
It is.
And
why is your Six Flags so bad?
I go there every year because my daughter gets free tickets for reading books, and I take her every year, and I get so frustrated. And after being to Silver Dollar City and Holiday World and some of the other ones nearby, I'm like, can't they at least be that good? Does it have to be this bad? Can we just drive 4 hours and not go to Six Flags?
It's not based in theme, right? I mean, they've sort of pulled themes. They've pulled from the DC universe, and they pulled from like the Looney Tunes and all these things. They try to pull all these things in, but what you have is an amusement park with like overlays of like Looney Tunes. So like, you know, there's a couple of attractions at Six Flags that are like really old and kind of cool. Like they used to have this mine train kind of thing.
Yeah, they still do. Yeah, they have the mine train and the log flume, and some of those are the best rides in the park, though.
Agreed. And I think that's the best part. But they went away from that and went to those super, you know, how are you going to get people in here? Well, Silver Dollar City's doing the same thing. They've got these charming parts. The Christmas celebration at Silver Dollar City is probably one of the best in the country, you know, maybe outside of Disneyland or Walt Disney World. Yet the big focus is on, you know, thrill.
Yeah. Well, I think I need to have you back, maybe just to talk about Silver Dollar City at some point, because especially after I get there again, because I went a few years ago, but I haven't been yet. So, can you give me any hints with your upcoming WEDWay Radio or 3020Eight of what you're going to talk about coming up?
Yeah. Okay. So on WEDWay Radio, you know, we've already done 2 shows in the finale season. We're working on more. We put out a couple of now shows that are just kind of weird shows that we wanted to do, but then, you know, we've done Western River Expedition. We've done the Carthay Circle Theater. I know that there's a Spaceship Earth show in there that's taking a bit of time to research. There's going to be some Horizon shows in there. There's going to be, hopefully, a couple of shows on the people who sort of made Disney, whether that's Roy or Walt or whomever. And so a lot of big shows that, like, in any other year we would, like, kick off to the future. But I think, you know, this time around, we're going to sink our teeth in and just, you know, do some really big stuff that we've never done.
That sounds really fun. And you're talking Spaceship Earth and Horizons. You're like speaking my language here. So it's all good. So if the listeners want to learn more about 3020Eight or WEDWay Radio, or what's the best way to kind of stay in touch with what you're doing?
I think Twitter has been and will always be the best way to stay in touch with WEDWay Radio, the 3020Eight, or Nate, or myself, or Kevin Quigley. You know, it's easy to find us on there. I'm at 3020Eight or Schmadvertising. Those are my handles. And then Kevin is at Kevidently. He's always been there. And Nate's at WEDWay Radio. So it's pretty easy to find us. If you want to go back and listen to old WEDWay Radios, there's a show on just about everything. I recommend the 1.0 series, which is literally looking at the lands of Disneyland from the sort of authentic beginnings, where they came from, where you had shops that were, you know, real shops on the street that they were like, oh yeah, Walt's buddy owns this bra shop. Let's put it on Main Street. That kind of stuff.
Well, those shows are really fun. It's kind of crazy to think about how much has changed, even at Disneyland. So yeah, the podcasts are great, and I'm excited to hear what's coming up. So thanks so much for doing this podcast. It was great. If you'd like to keep up with everything that's happening at the Tomorrow Society, you can go to tomorrowsociety.com, sign up for my email list, or read all the latest blog posts. You can also follow me on Twitter at TomorrowSOC, or Facebook or Instagram at Tomorrow Society. If you'd like to get a hold of me, you can email me, Dan at tomorrowsociety.com. I would love to find out what are some of your favorite regional parks, similar to Silver Dollar City in your area. And I'll be posting that question out on Facebook and Twitter very soon. The music for this podcast is composed by Adam Hookey and performed by the Sophisticated Babies. Check out Adam's music at adamhucke.com. Thank you so much for listening. I'll be back talking with you again very soon.